In the spring of 1242 AD, on the frozen surface of Lake Peipus in the vast snowy wilderness between Novgorod and the lands of the Teutonic Order, a small but heavily armored force of roughly 800 Teutonic Knights and their crusader allies, clad in gleaming white mantles with black crosses and mounted on powerful warhorses, launched a bold charge across the ice to crush what they believed was a disorganized horde of pagan Russians, only to meet a brilliantly prepared army of 30,000 warriors under the command of the young Prince Alexander Nevsky of Novgorod, who had turned the frozen lake into a deadly trap where the knights' famed heavy cavalry charge would become their undoing. The Teutonic Order, fresh from victories in Prussia and Livonia, had been invited by the Pope to launch a crusade against the Orthodox Russians, seeing in the schism between Eastern and Western Christianity an opportunity to expand their Baltic domains eastward, while Alexander Nevsky, already celebrated for defeating Swedish invaders on the Neva River 2 years earlier, rallied the princes of Novgorod and Vladimir along with Tatar auxiliaries and local militia to defend the motherland against these Western aggressors who threatened not just territory but the very soul of Orthodox Russia. As the knights formed their famous wedge formation, the boar's head, with lances lowered and banners flying, they thundered across the ice expecting to smash through the Russian center as they had against lighter pagan forces before. But Nevsky had studied their tactics and positioned his strongest infantry in the middle to absorb the shock while placing archers and cavalry on the wings to envelop the attackers once they were committed, turning the knights' momentum against them on the treacherous frozen surface where heavy horses and armored men risked breaking through at any moment. The clash began with a thunderous impact as the Teutonic wedge struck the Russian center, lances splintering and swords flashing in the cold April light, the knights cutting deep into the infantry ranks with disciplined fury while Russian spearmen and axemen held their ground with desperate courage, the ice groaning under the weight of thousands but holding firm in the initial fury. Yet as the battle raged, Nevsky's wings began to close like a vice, archers loosing volleys into the packed knightly formation while Russian cavalry harassed the flanks, forcing the crusaders into an ever-tighter mass where their heavy armor became a liability in the press of bodies and the slippery surface slowed their horses to a walk. The turning point came when the ice, weakened by spring thaw and the pounding of hooves, began to crack beneath the concentrated weight of the knights in the center, panic spreading as horses reared and men in full plate began to sink into the freezing water, their heavy mail pulling them down even as they tried to retreat, while Russian infantry pressed forward with spears and clubs to push more into the widening fissures. In the chaotic climax, hundreds of Teutonic knights and their sergeants drowned in the dark waters beneath the breaking ice, their white mantles disappearing into the depths as Alexander's warriors cheered from the solid shores, the surviving crusaders fleeing in disorder back toward Livonia with perhaps half their number lost in a single afternoon. The victory at Lake Peipus halted the Teutonic eastward expansion for generations, preserved Novgorod's independence and Orthodox faith, elevated Alexander Nevsky to legendary status as protector of Russia, later canonized as a saint, and demonstrated that even the most feared heavy cavalry of Europe could be crushed by clever tactics, terrain, and unbreakable resolve when defending homeland against foreign crusaders. Consider how those 800 Teutonic knights, charging with lances lowered across the frozen lake in pursuit of glory and conversion, were instead crushed by 30,000 Russians who turned the ice itself into a weapon of divine judgment, saving not just a city but the soul of a nation and forging an eternal legend of defiance that would inspire Russia through every future trial, proving once again that no armor is thick enough to withstand the will of a people fighting for their freedom on ground chosen by fate itself. The aftermath of the battle on the ice in 1242 sent shockwaves through the medieval world, for the Teutonic Order, once the unstoppable vanguard of Catholic expansion in the Baltic, suffered a humiliation from which their eastern ambitions never fully recovered. The loss of hundreds of elite knights and brothers in the freezing waters of Lake Peipus, not only depleting their manpower but shattering the myth of invincibility that had allowed them to conquer Prussian and Livonian tribes with relative ease, forcing the Grand Master to abandon plans for further crusades into Russia and instead consolidate holdings in Prussia where resistance continued for decades longer than anticipated. In Novgorod and the Russian principalities, Alexander Nevsky emerged as a national hero whose strategic genius had turned the invaders' greatest strength, their devastating heavy cavalry charge, into a fatal weakness by luring them onto terrain where weight became doom. His decision to fight on the lake despite the risk of thaw demonstrating a calculated gamble that paid off spectacularly when the ice held just long enough for the Russian wings to envelop and then cracked precisely where the knights were most concentrated. A moment later chroniclers would describe as divine judgment against the Latin aggressors who sought to impose Catholicism by sword on the Orthodox faithful. Nevsky's victory preserved Novgorod's lucrative trade with the Hanseatic League and maintained Russian political fragmentation under the Golden Horde's distant suzerainty rather than direct Western domination. A pragmatic choice that allowed the principalities to rebuild strength while the Mongols focused elsewhere, eventually enabling Moscow's rise as the gatherer of Russian lands under Ivan III, who would finally throw off the Tatar yoke 2 centuries later. The battle entered Russian folklore almost immediately, chroniclers like those of the Novgorod First Chronicle emphasizing how the ice broke and swallowed the god-hated Latins, while sparing the righteous defenders, a narrative that reinforced Orthodox identity against Catholic Europe and portrayed Nevsky as a saintly warrior whose relics would later work miracles, leading to his canonization in 1547 when Ivan the Terrible sought to legitimize Moscow's imperial claims by linking them to Nevsky's legacy of defending the faith. The Teutonic Order, though wounded, redirected their crusading zeal southward against Lithuania and Poland, their white-mantled knights becoming symbols of German eastward expansion that would culminate in the Prussian state's militaristic tradition centuries later. While in Russia the memory of Lake Peipus served as a rallying cry during later invasions from Swedes, Poles, and Napoleon, each time invoked to remind the people that foreign aggressors could be crushed on Russian soil through cunning and endurance. Archaeological traces of the battle remain elusive due to the lake's depth and shifting ice, but occasional finds of crossbow bolts, sword fragments, and mail links dredged from Peipus fuel ongoing interest, while the site itself, now on the Estonia-Russia border, hosts monuments on both sides. The Russian won a massive bronze Alexander Nevsky statue gazing sternly across the water, the Estonian a more subdued marker acknowledging the Livonian perspective. Sergei Eisenstein's 1938 film Alexander Nevsky, with Prokofiev's thunderous score, immortalized the battle for modern audiences in one of cinema's greatest sequences as knights in horned helmets charge across cracking ice to their doom, the scene's choreography influencing countless depictions of medieval combat and embedding the image of breaking ice as synonymous with Russian defiance against Western invaders. The victory also influenced military thought, demonstrating how lighter, more mobile forces could negate heavy cavalry by choosing terrain carefully, lessons studied by later commanders facing similar armored threats, while the political acumen of Nevsky in submitting to the Mongols to avoid two-front war became a model for Russian statecraft in dealing with stronger neighbors. Annual commemorations at the lake draw reenactors in reproduction Teutonic surcoats and Russian lameller, clashing with blunted weapons on safe ground while tourists watch the famous ice sequence projected on screens, keeping the drama alive for new generations. The battle's legacy extended into the Soviet era when Stalin revived Nevsky as a patriotic symbol against Nazi invasion. The Order of Alexander Nevsky Medal awarded to officers for bold leadership, while post-Soviet Russia continues to honor him as a unifier and defender whose pragmatic choices preserved the nation's core until it could rise stronger. Consider how those 800 Teutonic Knights who charged with righteous fury across the frozen lake in 1242, their lances lowered and crosses gleaming in pursuit of holy conquest, were instead crushed by 30,000 Russians who turned the very ice beneath their feet into an instrument of destruction, not only halting a crusade but preserving Orthodox Russia through centuries of trial, forging a legend of strategic genius and divine favor that continues to define national identity and remind the world that even the most formidable armored hosts can be brought low when they invade a land whose defenders fight with cunning, faith, and the unforgiving power of winter itself on ground where fate has already chosen the victor. The cultural resonance of the battle on the ice in 1242 permeated Russian art, literature, and national consciousness for centuries, becoming a cornerstone of identity that portrayed Russia as the eternal defender of orthodoxy against Western aggression. With Alexander Nevsky elevated to mythic status in chronicles that described angels fighting alongside his warriors and the lake itself rising in righteous fury to swallow the crusaders, a narrative that served political purposes during the rise of Muscovy when grand princes traced their lineage to Nevsky's prudent diplomacy with the Mongols while emphasizing his martial triumph over the Latins to justify expansion into Baltic lands once held by the Teutonic Order. The battle's memory influenced Russian military tradition, emphasizing the value of terrain, weather, and massed infantry over elite cavalry, Lessons applied in later conflicts from the time of troubles to the Great Northern War, when Peter the Great finally subdued Swedish and Polish threats. While the Teutonic defeat marked the beginning of the order's long decline, their resources diverted to endless Prussian revolts and eventual secularization under the Hohenzollerns, who transformed knightly holdings into the militaristic Prussian state that would one day forge modern Germany. In the 19th century, Romantic historians and artists rediscovered the battle as a symbol of Slavic resilience. Composers like Rimsky-Korsakov drawing on folk tales of Nevsky for operas that celebrated Russian spirit against foreign invaders, while painters depicted the dramatic ice-breaking moment with knights in gleaming armor vanishing into dark waters beneath triumphant Russian banners. The Soviet era amplified the legend exponentially, Stalin commissioning Eisenstein's masterpiece in 1938 as anti-Nazi propaganda that portrayed the Teutonic Knights as proto-fascists in horned helmets marching to Wagner-like marches. The film's iconic sequence of charging cavalry crashing through shattering ice becoming one of cinema's most powerful metaphors for hubris punished. Prokofiev's score with its thunderous battle on the ice movement still evoking chills when played in concert halls worldwide. During World War II, the Order of Alexander Nevsky was instituted as a military decoration for officers showing bold initiative, pilots and tank commanders wearing the medal with Nevsky's profile as they fought German invaders who ironically traced their own lineage to the same Teutonic tradition. A historical irony not lost on Soviet propagandists who screened Eisenstein's film to troops heading to the front. Post-war, the battle site on Lake Peipus became a place of pilgrimage. Soviet monuments erected portraying Nevsky as a broad-shouldered colossus sword in hand gazing westward, while Estonian historians on the other side emphasized the Livonian perspective of defending against Russian expansion, creating competing narratives that persist today with Russian and Estonian markers standing kilometers apart across the modern border. Archaeological efforts, though challenged by the lake's depth and shifting bottom, have yielded crossbow bolts, sword fragments, and mail rings that confirm heavy fighting on ice, while winter divers occasionally locate larger artifacts like lance heads frozen in sediment. Each find featured in museums from Pskov to Tallinn that draw visitors fascinated by the clash of medieval orders. Annual reenactments gather hundreds in reproduction armor on safe frozen sections nearby. Teutonic surcoats with black crosses facing Russian lamellar and conical helmets in choreographed charges that end with symbolic ice-cracking effects. Tourists cheering the Russian victory as tradition demands. The battle's legacy extends into modern Russian statecraft, leaders invoking Nevsky's pragmatic balance, firm resistance to the West while accommodating Eastern powers, as a model for foreign policy, while the phrase battle on the ice has become shorthand for any decisive defeat of an overconfident aggressor on unfavorable ground. Popular culture keeps the story alive through books, video games recreating the wedge charge and ice collapse with dramatic slow motion, and documentaries exploring the site's frozen mysteries with underwater drones, ensuring new generations experience the thrill of how a vastly outnumbered elite force was crushed by clever tactics and the unforgiving Russian winter. The victory also influenced Orthodox liturgy. Nevsky's feast day celebrated with special hymns thanking God for delivering Russia from Latin heresy. Churches displaying icons of the prince with sword raised over drowning knights as divine judgment made manifest. Consider how those 800 Teutonic Knights who rode forth in righteous array across the frozen lake in 1242. Their white mantles gleaming and crosses bold in pursuit of holy conquest and territorial glory, were instead crushed by 30,000 Russians who harnessed terrain, timing, and massed resolve to turn the ice into an ally that swallowed the invaders in dark waters, not only halting a crusade that threatened Orthodox Russia but preserving a distinct civilization through centuries of challenge, forging an unbreakable legend of strategic brilliance and heavenly favor that continues to define national character and inspire every defense of homeland against superior foes, proving eternally that no order of chivalry, however famed and feared, can prevail when it invades a land where winter itself fights for the defenders and fate has already written the outcome in frost and blood upon the unyielding ice. The enduring symbolism of the battle on the ice in 1242 has woven itself into the very fabric of Russian historical consciousness, serving as a foundational myth that portrays the nation as an eternal bulwark against Western encroachment, with Alexander Nevsky transformed from a 13th-century prince into an archetypal defender whose image graces icons, statues, and state propaganda across regimes, his calm strategic gaze and raised sword representing the ideal fusion of martial prowess, political wisdom, and divine favor that Russians have long seen as essential for survival amid powerful neighbors. The battle's depiction in art evolved from medieval chronicle miniatures showing stylized knights vanishing into stylized cracks to 19th-century academic paintings by artists like Vasily Surikov capturing the chaos of drowning men in full plate clawing at breaking ice while Russian infantry pressed forward with inexorable calm. Each era reinterpreting the event to suit contemporary needs, Romantic nationalism celebrating Slavic unity, Soviet realism emphasizing collective resistance against fascist-like invaders, and post-Soviet narratives balancing pride in defense with acknowledgement of medieval complexity. The site's physical legacy on Lake Peipus remains contested, the Russian side maintaining a monumental complex with Nevsky's towering bronze statue sword in hand overlooking the water as if still commanding the field, while Estonian interpretations highlight the Livonian Knights as defenders of local Baltic tribes against Russian expansionism, creating a layered historical dialogue that reflects ongoing regional tensions even 8 centuries later. Reenactments draw international enthusiasts who painstakingly recreate Teutonic white surcoats with black crosses and Russian conical helmets with nasal guards, staging charges on frozen sections with choreographed ice effects using modern materials to simulate the catastrophic break, while winter festivals feature folk dances retelling the story through movement and song, children learning verses about how the lake rose to swallow the proud foreigners. The battle influenced Russian military doctrine profoundly, generals from Kutuzov facing Napoleon to Zhukov against Hitler studying how Nevsky used weather and terrain to negate enemy advantages, the winter campaign becoming a template for luring invaders deep into Russia where cold and distance achieve what numbers cannot, a strategy that claimed millions of lives across centuries but preserved the state's existence each time. The Teutonic Order's defeat accelerated their shift from crusading zeal to pragmatic governance in Prussia, laying foundations for the militaristic state that Bismarck would later unify into Germany, an unintended consequence where the Knights' Baltic holdings became the cradle of Prussian discipline that would challenge Russia again in future wars. In Orthodox tradition, Nevsky's victory reinforced the concept of Holy Rus as a third Rome after Constantinople's fall, Moscow inheriting the mantle of true Christianity uncompromised by Latin heresy, a narrative Ivan III and his successors used to justify gathering Russian lands and resisting Polish-Lithuanian incursions during the time of troubles. The battle's cinematic immortality through Eisenstein's masterpiece ensured global recognition, the sequence of charging knights accompanied by Prokofiev's pounding score becoming shorthand for hubris punished in film language worldwide, influencing directors from Kurosawa to Spielberg in depicting massed cavalry doom, while the film's restoration and international screenings keep the visual drama alive for audiences far removed from medieval Baltic struggles. Modern Russian media continues the tradition with television series exploring Nevsky's youth and diplomacy with the Golden Horde, portraying his submission to Mongol authority as wise realpolitik that preserved Russian strength for future liberation. A controversial but enduring interpretation that frames the prince as master of survival amid impossible choices. Archaeological work on both sides of the border yields occasional finds. Crossbow quarrels frozen in peat, fragments of chain mail weighted with lake silt, horse bits from drowned chargers, that confirm the scale of loss beneath the waves, each artifact displayed in museums that draw pilgrims and scholars alike seeking connection to the moment Russia turned back the West at its frozen frontier. The battle's anniversary on April 5th brings ceremonies with church bells ringing across Pskov and Novgorod, military bands playing Prokofiev arrangements, and veterans laying wreaths at Nevsky monuments as if honoring contemporary defenders, the ritual linking past triumph to present resolve. Consider how those 800 Teutonic Knights who advanced in disciplined array across the gleaming ice of Lake Peipus in 1242, their white mantles and black crosses radiant with crusading purpose as they sought to impose Latin order on Orthodox lands, were instead crushed by 30,000 Russians who harnessed winter's unforgiving power and strategic patience to turn the frozen lake into a grave for the invaders, not only repelling a crusade that threatened Russia's faith and freedom, but establishing an enduring archetype of national defense through cunning and endurance that has sustained the Russian spirit through every subsequent invasion and trial, forging a legacy of resilience and divine protection that continues to shape identity and strategy across centuries, proving with timeless certainty that no chivalric order, however renowned and armored, can conquer a people who fight on ground where nature and resolve align to make the battlefield itself the ultimate weapon against those who would impose foreign will upon the sacred soil of the motherland. The battle on the ice in 1242 not only halted the Teutonic Order's eastward crusade but reshaped the medieval Baltic world in profound ways that echoed for centuries, as the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, already merged with the Teutonics after their own disastrous defeat at Saul in 1236, found their momentum broken, their recruitment of Western knights drying up when tales spread of entire contingents vanishing beneath Russian ice, forcing the order to adopt a more defensive posture in Estonia and Latvia, where local tribes like the Estonians and Latvians continued sporadic revolts that drained resources meant for further Russian campaigns. Alexander Nevsky's triumph strengthened Novgorod's position as the wealthiest and most independent Russian principality, its fur trade with the Hanseatic League flourishing undisturbed, while the city's Veche assembly of merchants and boyars maintained republican traditions longer than anywhere else in Russia, a legacy of self-governance that Nevsky protected by refusing to allow Mongol tax collectors direct access and instead negotiating tribute payments that preserved local autonomy. The battle's religious dimension deepened the schism between Orthodox East and Catholic West, Russian chronicles portraying the Teutonic Knights as heretics punished by God for attempting to impose the Latin Rite, a narrative that justified later Russian claims to protect Orthodox brethren in the Baltic and influenced Ivan III's ideology when he married Sophia Paleologos and adopted the double-headed eagle as symbol of Moscow as Third Rome inheriting Byzantine legacy free from Latin contamination. The ice-breaking climax became a potent metaphor in Russian literature and historiography for divine intervention in national crises, poets from the 16th century onward invoking Lake Peipus alongside the stand on the Ugra River in 1480 when Ivan III faced down the Golden Horde without battle, both events seen as moments when heaven turned the elements against invaders threatening Russian sovereignty. The Teutonic defeat contributed to the order's gradual secularization, their grand masters increasingly acting as German princes rather than monk knights, culminating in Albert of Prussia converting to Lutheranism in 1525 and turning the order's lands into the Duchy of Prussia, a transformation that laid groundwork for Brandenburg-Prussia's rise and eventual German unification under Prussian leadership that would clash with Russia again in the 18th and 20th centuries. In Russian iconography, Nevsky appeared with halo and sword raised over drowning knights, his relics in Vladimir translated with great ceremony when Moscow asserted primacy, miracles attributed to him during Polish invasions of the time of troubles when false Dimitris threatened the throne, the prince's intercession credited with saving the nation once more. The battle site's enduring mystery, the exact location debated between the Russian warm lake and Estonian interpretations, adds to its allure, sonar surveys revealing anomalies on the lake bottom interpreted as mass graves or equipment concentrations, while winter ice fishing occasionally brings up medieval artifacts that make headlines and fuel patriotic sentiment. Reenactment societies from Russia, Estonia, Germany, and beyond gather annually with meticulously researched kit. Teutonic great helms with horns for commanders, Russian scale armor with saintly icons sewn on, blunted weapons clashing in choreographed charges that end with symbolic retreat rather than ice-breaking for safety, drawing crowds who cheer the Russian victory as tradition demands. The Eisenstein film's influence extends to global cinema, directors borrowing the charging cavalry silhouette against dramatic sky for epic battle sequences, while Prokofiev's score is performed worldwide with choruses singing the Rise, Ye Russian People hymn that rallied Soviet citizens against Nazi invasion. Modern Russian military awards continue the tradition with the Order of Alexander Nevsky revived for officers showing initiative, tank commanders in Ukraine today wearing the medal with Nevsky's profile as they defend against new Western-backed threats, the historical parallel drawn explicitly in state media. The battle's lessons in asymmetric warfare, using environment to negate technological superiority, remain studied in academies from Moscow to Beijing, generals noting how Nevsky lured the knights onto ice just thick enough to support initial charge but not prolonged fighting, a masterpiece of calculated risk that turned enemy strength into fatal weakness. Tourism to the site flourishes with Russian-side bus tours visiting the massive Nevsky monument where visitors lay flowers and take photos against the frozen expanse, while Estonian guides offer balanced views emphasizing local Baltics suffering under both powers. Annual Orthodox services at the lake commemorate the victory with priests in golden vestments blessing the waters that once swallowed the invaders, bells ringing across ice as if echoing the original clash. Consider how those 800 Teutonic Knights who advanced with disciplined pride across the gleaming ice of Lake Peipus in 1242, their white mantles and black crosses blazing with crusading zeal as they sought to bring Orthodox Russia under Latin dominion, were instead crushed by 30,000 Russians who wielded winter's merciless power and strategic mastery to make the frozen lake itself the instrument of their destruction, not only repelling a holy war that threatened faith and freedom, but establishing an unbreakable archetype of national salvation through cunning endurance and heavenly alliance that has fortified Russian resolve through every subsequent tempest of history, forging a legacy of resilience and divine guardianship that continues to illuminate the path of a people who have learned across millennia that when invaders come with superior arms and righteous claims, the land and its defenders, united in unyielding spirit, will rise to cast them into oblivion beneath the unbreaking ice of destiny.